I always believed that I had the perfect marriage. My wife Laura was a brilliant and ambitious woman, a top-tier manager at a high-profile firm in Los Angeles. I, Brian, worked as an engineer. Our lives were busy, filled with late nights, conference calls, and weekend trips to escape the city's chaos. We were the couple everyone admired, the couple that had it all together. Or so I thought. It started with the little things, as it always does. Laura became more secretive, her phone always clutched tightly in her hand, the screen angled away whenever I entered the room. She was taking more business trips, and her explanations for staying late at the office were becoming increasingly vague. I wanted to trust her, I needed to trust her. But the doubt gnawed at me, a small, unrelenting voice in the back of my mind that refused to be silenced. The night everything changed began like any other. Laura had claimed she had a late meeting with a client and wouldn't be home until after midnight. I didn't think much of it at first. She was often busy, and I was used to her late hours. But something was different this time. The way she had avoided my eyes when she kissed me goodbye, the slight tremor in her voice when she said she'd be home late. My instincts told me something was off. As the hours ticked by, I tried to distract myself with work, but my mind kept wandering back to Laura. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, around 10 p.m., I decided to call her. The phone rang, but there was no answer. I tried again and again, but each time it went straight to voicemail. Panic began to set in. Where was she? Why wasn't she answering? I logged into the app we used to track each other's phones, a habit we developed years ago for safety reasons. Her location pinged at a hotel across town, far from where she was supposed to be. My heart sank. I knew the place, one of those upscale, discreet hotels where no questions are asked and privacy is guaranteed. Why was she there? 1,000 possibilities raced through my mind, each more dreadful than the last. I needed to see for myself, to know the truth. Grabbing my keys, I drove across town, my heart pounding with every passing mile. The traffic seemed to crawl, the lights taking forever to change. Every second felt like an eternity. When I finally arrived at the hotel, I felt sick to my stomach. I parked a block away and walked to the entrance, trying to stay calm, to think rationally. I approached the front desk, my voice steady as I asked if Laura was a guest. The clerk, professional and polite, informed me that they couldn't give out that information. My frustration boiled over, but I knew causing a scene wouldn't help. I took a deep breath and decided to wait. I found a secluded spot in the lobby where I could see the elevators and settled in, my eyes fixed on the doors. Minutes passed like hours, and just when I thought I couldn't stand it anymore, the elevator doors opened, and there she was. Laura stepped out, her hair slightly disheveled, her clothes wrinkled in a way that suggested she hadn't been in a business meeting. She was laughing, the kind of laugh she used to reserve for our private moments. And she wasn't alone. A tall man with a commanding presence walked beside her, his hand resting casually on the small of her back. They were far too comfortable with each other, far too intimate. My blood ran cold. I knew this man. His name was Carl, someone Laura had mentioned in passing as a client, nothing more. But now it was clear there was much more to their relationship than business. I watched as they walked out together, getting into his car without a second glance. They didn't see me, and I didn't make myself known. I just stood there, frozen in place, my world crumbling around me. When I finally made it back home, Laura was already there, sitting on the couch with a glass of wine in hand. She looked up at me as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just destroyed everything we'd built together. "You're home early," she said, her tone light, casual. I stared at her, trying to understand how she could be so calm, so composed after what I had just witnessed. "Where were you tonight?" Laura I asked, my voice betraying the storm of emotions brewing inside me. She didn't even flinch. "I told you, I had a late meeting." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that there was some reasonable explanation, that I hadn't just seen my wife with another man. but her lies were too smooth, too rehearsed. I knew the truth, even if she refused to admit it. For the first time in our marriage, I felt like a stranger in my own home. The woman sitting across from me was no longer the Laura I knew. She was someone else entirely, someone capable of lying to my face without a second thought. I went to bed that night, my mind racing, my heart aching. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed to understand what was happening, why she was doing this. I needed to know the full extent of her betrayal before I could decide what to do next. And so, the facade of our perfect life began to crack, revealing the darkness that had been lurking just beneath the surface. The next few days were a blur of suspicion and doubt. I tried to act normal, but the seed of betrayal had taken root, and I couldn't ignore it. Laura continued with her routine, as if nothing had changed, her smile as radiant as ever, her words just as sweet. But I saw through the veneer. Now I saw the lies beneath every casual remark, the deceit hidden in every affectionate gesture. I began to watch her more closely, paying attention to the smallest details. Every time she left the house, every phone call she made, every text she sent, I scrutinized it all, looking for signs of her infidelity. And the more I watched, the more I uncovered. It started with her phone. Laura had always been private about her phone, but now she seemed almost paranoid, never letting it out of her sight. One evening, while she was in the shower, I seized the opportunity. But her phone was on the nightstand, the screen locked. I knew her passcode. It was our anniversary date, something she had chosen years ago, back when we were still happy, still in love. My hands trembled as I typed in the numbers. The phone unlocked, and I was met with a flood of messages, notifications, and emails. But it was the texts that caught my attention. A long string of messages between her and Carl, hidden under a contact name that was anything but suspicious work. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrolled through the messages. There were photos, flirtatious comments, and explicit exchanges, proof of a relationship that went far beyond anything I had imagined. But what disturbed me even more were the discussions about me. Carl had been feeding her lies, planting seeds of doubt about our marriage, convincing her that I was untrustworthy, that I was hiding something from her. In one message he wrote, "Brian's been acting strange, hasn't he? I think he's catching on. You need to be careful. Maybe it's time to consider getting out before things get messy." I felt sick to my stomach. Not only was my wife cheating on me, but she was also being manipulated by this man, a man who seemed to have his own agenda. I wanted to confront her right then, to demand answers, but I knew I needed to keep calm. I needed more information. Over the next few days, I followed Laura whenever she left the house. It wasn't difficult. She had grown so comfortable in her deception that she no longer bothered to cover her tracks. I trailed her to meetings with Carl, watching from a distance as they embraced, shared private moments, and made plans that had nothing to do with her work. I learned that Carl wasn't just some random guy. He was connected, deeply connected. His position within the intelligence community gave him access to information and resources that most people could only dream of. It also meant he was dangerous, far more dangerous than Laura could have realized. It became clear that Carl was using Laura for more than just an affair. He had access to classified information, and Laura, with her high-level management position, had access to sensitive data from various clients. I didn't know the full extent of it yet, but I knew Carl was manipulating her, using their relationship to gain access to something valuable, something that could have serious consequences. The more I uncovered, the more desperate I became. Laura was in over her head, and she didn't even know it. She was being used as a pawn in a game far bigger than either of us, and if I didn't act soon, things could spiral out of control. But I couldn't just go to her with what I knew. Carl had convinced her that I was the enemy, that I was the one trying to trap her. She wouldn't believe me, at least, not without undeniable proof. So I kept digging, searching for something that would make her see the truth. Then the phone calls started. At first they were just odd, late-night hang-ups, nothing more than static on the other end. But soon the calls became more frequent, more ominous. Sometimes there would be heavy breathing, other times just silence. Laura would glance at the caller ID, her expression shifting from confusion to fear. But when I asked about it, she brushed it off, saying it was probably a wrong number or a prank. But I knew better. Someone was watching her, someone who knew what she was involved in, and they were getting closer. I began to fear that it wasn't just Carl who was using her, there were others involved, others who might be watching both of us. One night I came home to find Laura sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. A strange man had shown up at the house earlier that day, she told me, asking questions about her work, about Carl. She described him as cold, intimidating, someone who clearly wasn't just there to chat. I could see the fear in her eyes, but still, she didn't fully trust me. Carl's influence over her was strong, stronger than I had anticipated. He had her convinced that I was the one pulling the strings, that I was the one trying to expose her. And so, despite her fear, she continued to lie to me, continued to sneak around with Carl, all while trying to protect herself from threats she didn't fully understand. It was a nightmare, a twisted game of cat and mouse, where the lines between friend and foe were blurred beyond recognition. I was losing her, losing the woman I loved, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then something changed. Laura began to unravel. The lies, the secrecy, the pressure, it was all getting to her. She started to slip up, to leave clues behind, as if subconsciously she wanted to be caught, wanted this nightmare to end. She began to show signs of paranoia, jumping at every sound, growing more and more distant. I knew the time was coming when I would have to confront her, to lay everything out in the open, but I needed to do it in a way that would shock her back to reality, to make her see the truth before it was too late. Because the truth was, Laura wasn't the only one being used. I had my own secrets that would change everything, and it was time for them to come to light. The tension in our home became unbearable. Laura's paranoia escalated with every passing day. She was no longer the confident, composed woman I had married. She was a shadow of herself, constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest noise. The late-night calls continued, and the visits from strangers became more frequent. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was closing in on her, and she was terrified. One evening, after another tense dinner where we barely spoke, Laura announced she was going out for a drive to clear her head. I watched her grab her keys and leave, her movements jittery, almost frantic. I knew she was going to meet Carl. This had to stop, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer to confront her. I followed her, keeping a safe distance. As expected, she drove straight to Carl's apartment, not even bothering to check if she was being tailed. I parked a few blocks away and watched as she went inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I weighed my options. This was it, the moment where everything would come to a head. But I couldn't just storm in there without a plan. After a few minutes, I stepped out of the car and made my way to Carl's building. I found the side entrance and slipped inside, my nerves on edge. I knew the layout from the research I had done, and I made my way to Carl's apartment with silent, determined steps. As I approached the door, I could hear their voices through the thin walls. Laura was crying, her voice panicked, desperate. Carl's tone was smooth, comforting, but there was an edge to it, a coldness that made my blood run cold. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked on the door, hard enough to startle them. There was a brief silence, and then I heard Carl's voice. "Who is it?" "It's Brian," I replied, my voice steady. "We need to talk." There was a pause, and I could imagine the look on Laura's face as she realized what was happening. The door opened a crack, and Carl's face appeared. He looked surprised, but not entirely shocked. He had been expecting this confrontation. "Brian," he said smoothly, opening the door wider. "This is unexpected." "Let me in," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Carl hesitated, then stepped aside, allowing me to enter. Laura was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She looked at me, then at Carl, as if unsure of what was about to happen. The tension in the room was thick, almost suffocating. "What are you doing here?" Brian, Laura asked, her voice trembling. She tried to sound angry, but I could hear the fear underneath. "I know everything, Laura," I said, my eyes never leaving hers. "I know about you and Carl. I know about the affair, the lies, everything." She stared at me, her face a mix of shock and horror. "Brian, Save it," I cut her off, my voice cold. "You've been lying to me for months. But it's not just the affair, Laura. It's what you've been doing for Carl. I know he's been using you to get access to your company's data. I know he's been manipulating you." Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at Carl, as if seeking reassurance. But Carl's expression had changed. The smooth, confident mask he usually wore was gone, replaced by something much darker. "What are you talking about?" Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Laura, I haven't been completely honest with you either. I'm not just an engineer. I work for the government. I was assigned to investigate Carl." The room fell silent. Laura's eyes widened, her tears forgotten as she processed what I had just said. Carl's expression hardened, and I saw the flicker of anger in his eyes. "You're lying," Laura whispered, shaking her head. "This is some kind of trick." "You're trying to." "I'm not lying, Laura," I interrupted, my voice firm. "I've been investigating Carl for months. He's been using you, feeding you lies to get what he wants. That's why those people have been following you, why you've been getting those calls. They're after Carl, and you're caught in the middle." Laura looked at me, then at Carl, who remained silent. The truth was sinking in, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. She had been a pawn in a game far bigger than she had ever imagined. "You bastard," she whispered, turning to Carl, her voice trembling with rage. "You used me. You." Carl moved quickly, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Enough," he snapped, his voice cold. "You're not thinking clearly, Laura. He's trying to turn you against me." Laura struggled in his grip, her fear giving way to anger. "Let me go, Carl. You've been lying to me this whole time." I took a step forward, my hands clenched into fists. "Let her go, Carl. This ends now." Carl's eyes narrowed, and for a moment I thought he was going to make a move. But then he released Laura, pushing her away from him. She stumbled back, and I caught her before she could fall. "You're both fools," Carl said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you know what's going on, but you have no idea." I held Laura close, my eyes locked on Carl. "It's over, Carl. You've been exposed. The authorities are already on their way." Carl smirked, his eyes cold and calculating. "You really think this is over, Brian? You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into." He took a step toward the door, and I tensed, ready to stop him. But he just smiled, a dark, menacing smile that sent a chill down my spine. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low. "Not by a long shot." With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Laura and me standing there in stunned silence. The door slammed shut behind Carl, the echo lingering in the room like a physical presence. Laura and I stood there, frozen, the weight of everything that had just happened pressing down on us. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Laura pulled away from me, her hands trembling as she wiped at her eyes. "Brian, what the hell is going on? What did you mean you're not just an engineer? Is this some kind of sick joke?" I could see the desperation in her eyes, the need for answers. But there was also something else, fear that everything she thought she knew was a lie. I couldn't blame her, she was right to be afraid. This situation had spiraled far beyond the boundaries of a simple affair, into a territory that was dangerous for everyone involved. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Laura, I never wanted it to come to this. I wanted to protect you. But I can't keep you in the dark anymore. I work for a government agency. I was assigned to investigate Carl months ago. We suspected he was involved in something big, something dangerous. When I realized you were involved with him, I had to keep quiet to protect you." to keep you safe until we had enough evidence to bring him down." Her face drained of color, and she took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "You knew? You knew what he was doing, and you just let it happen. You let me get pulled into this without warning me." "It wasn't that simple," I said, my voice pleading. "I couldn't just blow my cover. Carl is smart, dangerously so. If he had known who I really was, he would have disappeared, and you might have been caught in the crossfire. I had to play along, gather evidence, and wait for the right moment, but I never wanted you to be hurt. Laura, I never wanted this." Laura turned away from me, pacing the room, her hands running through her hair in frustration. "So, all this time, you were just lying to me, pretending like everything was normal while you were spying on me? On him? How could you do that, Brian? How could you keep this from me?" "I didn't have a choice," I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "You think I enjoyed watching you with him? You think it didn't tear me apart to see you sneaking around, lying to my face every day? But I had to keep going for your sake, because if Carl had figured it out, you'd be dead, Laura. Do you understand that? You were playing with fire. And you didn't even know it." She stopped pacing, her back to me, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold back tears. The truth was out now, but it wasn't the relief I had imagined. It was devastating for both of us. Everything we had built together, everything we had once been, was now in ruins. "Why didn't you just tell me?" she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Why didn't you just trust me?" "Because I didn't know if I could," I admitted, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "I didn't know how deep you were in with him, and I didn't know if you'd choose me or him." Laura turned to face me, her eyes red and puffy, but there was a fire in them now, a defiance that I hadn't seen in months. "You should have trusted me, Brian. After everything we've been through, you should have known I would never betray you like that." Her words stung, but I knew they were true. I had failed her in more ways than one, and now we were both paying the price. But I couldn't change the past. All I could do was try to fix the mess we were in before it got any worse. "Laura, I know I made mistakes," I said, my voice softer now. "But we don't have time to dwell on that. Carl's out there, and he knows we're onto him. He's not going to just sit back and let this slide. He'll come after us, both of us. Because now he knows you can't be trusted either. We have to be smart about this. We have to work together if we're going to survive." She looked at me, her expression torn. I could see the conflict in her eyes, whether to trust me, to believe that I was telling the truth, or to run, to try to escape the nightmare that her life had become. For a moment, I thought she might choose the latter. But then she took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice firm, though her hands still trembled slightly. "Okay, I'll trust you. But you have to promise me, no more lies, no more secrets. We're in this together now, right?" I nodded, relief flooding through me. Right, together. But even as I said the words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. The situation was far more dangerous than Laura realized, and there were still secrets I hadn't revealed, secrets that could change everything once again. We spent the next few hours planning our next move. Laura was terrified, but she was also angrier than I had ever seen her. Carl had manipulated her, used her, and now he was a threat to both of us. She wanted to take him down as much as I did, but we both knew we couldn't do it alone. I made a few calls to my contacts, discreetly alerting them to the situation. We needed backup, but we also needed to keep things quiet. Carl was a slippery target, and if he got wind of what we were planning, he'd disappear before we had a chance to stop him. As the night wore on, Laura and I fell into an uneasy silence. The shock of the evening's events had left us both drained, and there was still so much unsaid between us. But there was no time to deal with our personal issues now. We had to stay focused, stay alert. Carl wouldn't stay hidden for long, and when he made his next move, we had to be ready. But deep down, I knew that the worst was yet to come. Carl wasn't the type to go down without a fight, and now that he knew we were onto him, he'd be more dangerous than ever. I had no idea what his endgame was, but I knew that if we weren't careful, we might not live to see it. And so we waited, the hours stretching out in tense silence, our thoughts consumed by the looming threat. Laura stayed close, her fear evident in every glance she cast my way, but there was also a new resolve in her, a determination to see this through, no matter the cost. But as the night dragged on, a new worry began to gnaw at me. Carl wasn't the only one we had to worry about. There were others involved in this mess, and I had a sinking feeling that they were already closing in. I just hoped that when the time came, Laura would be able to handle the truth, because the secrets I had kept from her so far were nothing compared to what I still hadn't revealed. The following morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. Laura and I had barely slept, the weight of what was to come pressing down on us. Every noise outside made us jump. Every creak of the house felt like a harbinger of doom. The reality of our situation was sinking in. We were in a deadly game, and the stakes couldn't be higher. I had managed to get in touch with my superiors early that morning, briefing them on the situation. They were sending a team, but they made it clear that we were on our own until then. Carl was highly skilled and extremely dangerous. They didn't want to risk alerting him too soon. It was a gamble, and we had no choice but to play along. Laura and I spent the morning in a tense quiet, going over the plan repeatedly. We would lay low, wait for Carl to make his move, and trap him. It was risky. Too many things could go wrong, but it was the only option we had. Carl knew too much and had too much at stake to simply walk away. He would come for us, and we had to be ready. By noon, the tension had grown unbearable. Laura, who had been pacing the living room for the better part of the morning, finally collapsed onto the couch, her nerves frayed. I sat down beside her, taking her hand in mine. "Laura," I began, my voice quiet. "There's something else you need to know, something I haven't told you yet." She looked at me, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of fear and frustration. "What is it, Brian? What else could there possibly be?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Carl isn't working alone. He's part of something much bigger, a network, a criminal syndicate that deals in stolen government secrets. That's why I was assigned to him. He's been using his position to gain access to classified information, and he's been using you to help him do it." Laura's face went pale. What are you saying? That I've been helping him steal government secrets?" "Brian, I didn't know. I had no idea." "I know you didn't," I reassured her, squeezing her hand. "You were a pawn in his game, Laura. But this isn't just about us anymore. If we don't stop him, countless lives could be at risk. This goes far beyond what you or I ever imagined." Laura pulled her hand away, her expression one of disbelief. "And you're just telling me this now? After everything that's happened? After everything I've done?" "I didn't want to drag you into this more than you already were," I said, my voice thick with regret. "But there's no turning back now. We're in this together, whether we like it or not. And we need to stop Carl before he can do any more damage." Laura looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was just..." Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands. I reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We're going to get through this, Laura. But we need to stay strong. We need to stay focused." She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "You're right. I'm sorry, Brian. I never wanted any of this." "I know," I said softly. "But we're here now, and we have to deal with it." As the day wore on, the anxiety only grew. We couldn't do much but wait, and the anticipation was agonizing. I knew Carl was out there, somewhere, planning his next move. Every hour that passed felt like a countdown to something terrible. And then, just as the sun began to set, the phone rang. Laura and I both jumped, the sound shattering the silence like a gunshot. I picked up the receiver, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello. Corio." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then a voice cold, calculating, and all too familiar. Brian. Carl's voice purred through the line. I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you? I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Carl, you and Laura have caused me quite a bit of trouble, Carl continued, his tone calm, almost amused. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm willing to let this go if you both agree to disappear. Leave town, forget about me, and I'll forget about you. You know that's not going to happen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's over, Carl. The authorities are on their way and there's nowhere left for you to run. Carl chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. You always were predictable, Brian. But you're wrong if you think this is over. You see, I have something you want, something you'll be very interested in. I tensed, my grip tightening on the phone. What are you talking about? Let's just say that I'm not the only one who's been watching you and Laura, Carl said, his voice dripping with smugness. And if you don't do exactly as I say, well, things could get very unpleasant for you both. I felt a surge of anger and fear. If you hurt her. Oh, Brian, you misunderstand me, Carl interrupted, his voice turning icy. I don't need to hurt Laura. I just need you to understand that you're playing a game you can't win. Walk away now while you still can. The line went dead, leaving me standing there in stunned silence, the phone still clutched in my hand. Laura looked at me, her face filled with dread. What did he say? I set the phone down, my mind racing. Carl was bluffing. He had to be. But there was a part of me that couldn't shake the feeling that he had more cards to play, that we were only seeing the surface of something much darker, much more dangerous. He wants us to leave town, I said finally, my voice heavy. To disappear and forget about him. Laura's eyes widened in shock. And if we don't? He made it clear that there would be consequences, I said grimly. But we can't just run, Laura. If we do, he'll keep going, keep hurting people. We have to stop him, no matter what. Laura's fear turned to determination, and she nodded. Then we do whatever it takes. We end this. We spent the next few hours preparing. I gathered every piece of evidence I had, every bit of information that could help us take Carl down. Laura was a flurry of activity, packing a bag with essentials in case we needed to make a quick escape. We were ready for anything, or so we thought. But just as we were finishing our preparations, there was a knock at the door. Laura and I froze, exchanging a tense glance. My hand went to the gun holstered at my side as I moved towards the door. I peeked through the peephole, my heart pounding in my chest. On the other side stood two men in suits, their faces stern and unreadable. They didn't look like Carl's men, but I wasn't about to take any chances. Who is it? Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. Stay back, I whispered in return, my hand tightening around the doorknob. I opened the door a crack, just enough to see them clearly. Can I help you? Brian, one of the men, said, his voice steady and authoritative. We're with the agency. We need to talk. My heart skipped a beat. Reinforcements had arrived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why hadn't they called ahead? Why just show up out of nowhere? I glanced back at Laura, who was watching from the hallway, her face a mask of fear and suspicion. I turned back to the men, forcing myself to stay calm. Show me your IDs. The men exchanged a glance, then reached into their pockets, pulling out their credentials. I inspected them carefully, my mind racing. Everything seemed legitimate, but after everything that had happened, I wasn't about to take anything at face value. All right, I said finally, opening the door wider. Come in. They stepped inside, their movements precise, controlled. I could tell they were professionals, agents like me, but something about them set off alarm bells in my mind. What's going on? Laura asked, her voice tight with anxiety. One of the men turned to her, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, we're here to take you both into protective custody. Carl is still at large, and we believe he may be planning something more serious. We need to move quickly, but protective custody. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't part of the plan. Something had changed, something big. And the look in the agent's eyes told me that there was more to this than they were letting on. I exchanged a glance with Laura, then nodded slowly. All right, let's go. As we gathered our things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap, that Carl had somehow anticipated this, and that we were playing right into his hands. But we had no choice. We had to trust the agency, trust that they knew what they were doing. Because if we didn't, we might not survive the night. As we stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. The night was still, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The agents led us towards their car, but with each step, the unease within me grew stronger. Something was wrong, but there was no turning back now. All we could do was follow them, hoping that this wasn't the final step into Carl's deadly trap, and that somehow we would find a way out of the darkness that surrounded us.